Ethical self-consciousness now learns from its deed the developed nature of what it actually did, as much when it obeyed divine law as when it followed human law. The law that is manifest to it is linked in the essence with its opposite. The essence is the unity of both, but the deed has only carried out one law in contrast to the other. But the two laws being linked in the essence, the fulfillment of the one evokes the other, and the deed, having made it so, calls it forth as a violated and now hostile entity demanding revenge. In the action, only one aspect of the resolve as such is clearly manifest. The resolve, however, is in itself the negative aspect which confronts the resolve with an other, with something alien to the resolve which knows what it does. Actuality, therefore, holds concealed within it the other aspect, which is alien to this knowledge, and does not reveal the whole truth about itself to consciousness. The son does not recognize his father in the man who has wronged him, and whom he slays, nor his mother in the queen whom he makes his wife. In this way, a power which shuns the light of day ensnares the ethical self-consciousness, a power which breaks forth only after the deed is done, and seizes the doer in the act. For the accomplished deed is the removal of the antithesis between the knowing self and the actuality confronting it. The doer cannot deny the crime or his guilt. The significance of the deed is that what was unmoved has been set in motion, and that what was locked up in mere possibility has been brought out into the open. Hence to link together the unconscious and the conscious, non-being with being. In this truth, therefore, the deed is brought out into the light of day as something in which the conscious is bound up with the unconscious, what is one's own with what is alien to it, as an entity divided within itself, whose other aspect consciousness experiences and also finds to be its own, but as the power it has violated and roused to hostility. Here in paragraph 469, where Hegel is continuing to work out this dialectic between action and doing and guilt and crime in terms of these two laws and how they play themselves out, and how they express what he's calling the ethical substance earlier on, or now the ethical essence. Hegel is going to invoke something that may be familiar to many of us, and that is the story of Oedipus. This is best known to us through Sophocles' plays, of course. There's a series, a trilogy, that has to do not only with Oedipus and his mother and father, but also with the kids who result from it. And Oedipus, by the first time, there's been this tragic end. His mother has killed herself. He's killed his father. Worse than that, he has married his mother, reigned as king for a long time, sought for the killer of his father without realizing that he was the very man. All of that, happens in the first part. But then there's a continuance, and the Antigone, which is a play that's playing an extremely central role here in Hegel's thought, is part of that sequence. Here, in this particular paragraph, we are looking primarily at the example of Oedipus, and we'll see how he fits in there. So you want to stay attuned to that. One thing I do want to get out of the way immediately, however, is don't import Freud's Oedipus complex, or whatever you happen to think about it or have heard about it, into reading this section. Hegel, of course, antedates Freud by almost a century, not quite, but certainly more than half of a century, and he is doing something quite different with Oedipus and Oedipus's children than is Freud in his talk about the complex. Freud is primarily focused on desire and family dynamics in terms of that. Hegel is focused on something else, action and knowledge and guilt. So, Hegel says, ethical self-consciousness learns from its deed the developed nature of what it actually did. This is a little bit of a convoluted translation here. It actually begins in the German by talking about the Handeln, the action, what we're translating here as what it actually did, right? And what we see here is there's a doing which then is consolidated, we might say, in something identifiable as an action, or we might say comportment, if we like, as well. Something definite, right? So ethical self-consciousness learns from its deed the developed nature of what it actually did. It's finding out more in what it actually did than it was experiencing in its deed originally. And Hegel goes on and tells us as much when it obeyed divine law as when it followed human law. So we could pick either side, but in either case, what is happening is this same dynamic. And it's possible for, the person who's following the divine law to engage in action that is then going to violate the human law. It is quite likely that the person who's following the human law is also going to violate the divine law in some way, at least at this point in the conflict between the ethical powers. Right? So Hegel goes on and he says, the law that is manifest to it is linked in the essence with its opposite. The law that the self-consciousness is grasping as ethical self-consciousness is linked to the other law. It's inescapable. Although ethical self-consciousness can be blinded by its allegiance to one of these laws and its, in fact, deep loyalty that in expressing the laws, it doesn't escape the other law by doing so. So he says, the essence is the unity of both of these laws. But the deed has only carried out one law in contrast to the other. So we have a sort of splitting taking place here. Hegel has already discussed this in previous paragraphs as this, enactment of the one side against an alien reality of the other side. And now that alien reality is going to exert its own agency, its own force. So, Hegel tells us the two laws, being linked in the essence, the fulfillment of the one evokes the other. And the deed, having made it so, calls it forth now as violated, as having been broken. And this is where guilt and crime are going to emerge. Now notice how Hegel talks about it here, though. The guilt and crime exist on the side of the self-consciousness. The law itself is going to express itself or be evoked or arise as a hostile entity, an enemy, in fact, demanding revenge. Rache is retribution, would be another way of saying it. So in the action, he says, only one aspect of the resolve, the Entschluss, the decision, the containing itself within itself, you might say, is clearly manifest. But the resolve, he says, is in itself the negative aspect which confronts the resolve with an other. So what does that mean? That means that this very action of resolve, this is almost Heideggerian, what Hegel is saying here, right? This very sort of containing within itself, carried out by the acting person, this consolidation and condensation leads to the other law. Because, again, we have the same logic of the self-same repelling itself from itself, or casting itself out. And what does it cast itself out to? The other law. It finds that there is more to the story than it originally construed itself as doing. How does it find this? It finds it not by sitting and speculating and saying, oh, I wonder how this is going to turn out. I really want to have a full, adequate picture of things speculatively, so I need to work this out for myself. No, it'll be through a drama in which other people are going to arrive on the scene, and eventually one confronts one's own guilt. So he says, and there's a beautiful way of expressing it here, actuality therefore holds concealed within it the other aspect which is alien to this knowledge, and does not reveal the whole truth about itself to consciousness. The example here is, again, of Oedipus. The son does not recognize his father in the man who has wronged him and whom he slays, nor the mother in the queen whom he makes his wife. Now, what is Hegel on about here? Why is this example particularly apt? So it might be helpful to understand a little bit more of the particulars of the story of Odysseus. Not Odysseus, Oedipus, I'm sorry. Although Odysseus would be very interesting here as well. So, Oedipus is born to a king and a queen. And there's a prophecy that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. And so being, decent parents, I won't say good parents, but decent parents, they say, well, we've got to do away with this kid. And now notice, it's not just about a family and family norms not being violated or incest taboos or something like that. This is a king and a queen. They cannot have that sort of debacle happening to their country. And so he's sent, he's supposed to be actually exposed and killed, but he winds up being fostered in Corinth by the king and queen there. And eventually he finds out about the prophecy himself and says, oh, I am not going to stick around and do that sort of thing to mom and dad. I better get the hell out of town. What ends up happening? Well, he goes back to Thebes, where he's originally from, and he meets a man along the way. And this man has a chariot and tells him to get the hell out of the way. And he says, I'm not getting out of the way. You get out of the way. And he kills him. And then he goes on and he gets to town. And when he gets to town, not long after that, they find out somebody killed the king. And Oedipus says, well, that's terrible, but I'm a pretty tough guy. I'll make sure there's law and order here. I'll marry that queen that you've got there. She's very pretty, by the way. And he does. And they have all sorts of children together. And the whole time, he's looking for an answer to this question. Who killed the king? Who killed my predecessor? Now, what had happened here? As Hegel tells us, the son had not recognized the father in the man that he was opposed to. This is almost the opposite of the Freud reference, isn't it? He doesn't recognize his father in the person who he winds up in a rivalry and ends up, killing according to the human law. The divine law would tell him, no, you cannot do something like that to your father. You have to obey your father, or something along those lines. The human law says, look, this guy got in your way and threatened you, you get to kill him. But then it also tells Oedipus, you should punish the person who killed the ruler before you. As a ruler, do your job and make sure that happens. Likewise, with the mother, he doesn't know that the person that he is marrying, the queen, is indeed his mother, the one who he makes his wife. So we have a double not knowing in this case. So, what does Hegel tell us about this? In this way, a power which shuns the light of day ensnares the ethical self-consciousness. That's a really interesting way to talk about it. A power which shuns the light of day ensnares the ethical self-consciousness. A power which breaks forth only after the deed is done and seizes the doer in the act. Oedipus did not proceed, again, this is why we want to put Freud away. Oedipus did not say, I really want to kill my dad and marry my mom. That's what I'm all about. No, he wants to do the opposite of that. And the very fact of that being mentioned is what provokes him to take the course of action that he does, which ends up killing his dad and marrying his mom. So there's something going on here that isn't just in self-consciousness, or if it is, it's something very subterranean, something almost chthonic. And it only comes out to say, gotcha, after the deed has been done. It's the sort of thing where you actually feel it's rather unfair. But you don't even get to really say that it's unfair because everybody by that time is pointing the finger at you, including yourself, and saying, guilt, crime, shame, look at what you've done. So, Hegel goes on. He tells us the doer cannot deny the crime or his guilt once it's come out. Now everything makes sense. But in making sense, it's terrible. We often talk, and this is a bit of a digression, as if learning the truth will set you free. It really depends on what that truth is, doesn't it? There are some truths where perhaps ignorance is not exactly bliss, but it's certainly not being tormented by what it is that you have done and the consequences of your action. So maybe sometimes you don't actually want to know, but in this case, the person can't avoid that. So he says this beautiful thing right after that. The accomplished deed is the removal of the antithesis between the knowing self and the actuality confronting it. Now, the term there that Hegel is using for removal is actually aufheben. In this case, aufgehoben, right? Describing the opposition or the antithesis that has now been sublated, has been removed, has been incorporated, you might say. And he tells us that, here we go, the antithesis between the knowing self and the actuality confronting it is gone. The doer cannot deny the crime or his guilt. Why not? Because now he knows it to be the case. And remember, this is an ethical doer to begin with. This is an ethical self-consciousness. This is not just, some person wandering around trying to do something fun or interesting or having adventures. This is somebody who is actually trying to do what is right, trying to find the truth of who they are and what indeed human beings are. And what they find out is they have done something perhaps irrevocable, perhaps terrible, perhaps totally unprecedented. He goes on and he says, the significance of the deed is that what was unmoved has been set in motion. Set in motion by who? By one's choice, by one's action, by one's starting the whole process in motion. In this case, again, Oedipus, he tells everybody, go out and find out who indeed killed my predecessor, not realizing his predecessor is his father and the fact that he himself is the man who did it. So he says, what was locked up in mere possibility has been brought out into the open. Hence, to link together. Now notice what Hegel's saying here. To link together the unconscious and the conscious. Non-being with being. That is part of what action does, is links non-being with being. There's a metaphysical aspect to action. It says, in the truth, therefore, the deed is brought out into the light of day as something in which the conscious is bound up with the unconscious, in which what is one's own with what is alien to it, as an entity divided within itself, whose other aspect consciousness experiences and also finds to be its own, but as the power it is violated and roused to hostility. So what is he saying there? Again, discussion of the conscious and unconscious probably wants to make you think here of Freud and of invoking him, but I think despite the fact that we're talking about Oedipus in this very passage, that may not be that helpful. How can we make sense of this in terms of the conscious and the unconscious just on its own face here in Hegel, without assuming something like a unconscious or subconscious to a person, and without assuming something perhaps like a collective unconscious. Well, we could just take the words as what they mean. There is a structure out there, and here we start to move more towards somebody who is, in fact, an orthodox Freudian in certain respects, but also extremely innovative in others, and that would be Jacques Lacan. The unconscious is not necessarily my unconscious or the unconscious of humanity writ large. Instead, it's something that is structured with a coherent but not understood system. And if you think about the family relations in the Oedipus story, there is something like that. It's not just family relations, it's family relations intersecting with political relations, intersecting with narrative. And nobody really puts together all the pieces, except for, of course, in Sophocles' version, the poor blind guy who sees the horrible thing that has not only is about to take place, but has taken place. The fact that Oedipus has already, by that time, killed his father, married his mother. Not only married his mother, but produced progeny with his mother. This guilt, this crime that's taking place, is bringing together the conscious and the unconscious, as Hegel is saying. Again, non-being with being. So he says, the deed has brought out into the light of day as something in which the conscious is bound up with the unconscious. What is one's own with what is alien to it? Oedipus did not say, as I pointed out, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. What he tried to do, again, following the ethical, following what he actually took to be right and what was right in some respects, turns out to also be tragically wrong. And he finds himself unable to extricate himself from the situation of guilt, crime, and shame. Worse, to go on further, not only has he screwed up his own life and those of his parents, he's also implicated his children within this entire structure. And that is going to turn out to be a fate that they cannot escape. This is going a little bit beyond what Hegel is talking about here in this passage, but I think it's worth dwelling on a bit. The narratives in which these sorts of things play out, doing in accordance with one law, violating another law in the process, both of these actually being norms that express the ethical which do exist in some way in self-consciousness, the one known, the other one unknown, the one conscious, the other one unconscious. All of this plays itself out not only within the scope of a single person's existence, but within generations. And that is part of what the law of the family or the divine law is able to emphasize for us. It also plays itself out within the larger society or culture, or to use Hegel's term that he likes to use so much, the nation. There are generational guilts that are carried. And sometimes acquiring knowledge about that is actually going to intensify the problem and make it more acute. We're placed in this interesting sort of quandary. Is it better just not to know and to conceal things? Well, if you do that, here's where actually there is something similar to Freud going on here. Freud talked about the return of the repressed. When you attempt to repress, to, verdrängen, push below something, sooner or later it's going to come out. It may not just be things like desires that we're not particularly happy that we have. It could also be a deadly history in which people's rights were violated and people had to, change their whole way of thinking in order to be able to feel okay with these people's rights, or whatever we want to call it, having been transgressed. This is part of what's going on, and the guilt and crime may be something that we inherit and take on, even though we did not ourselves originally create those through our action, through our doing. So he says that we wind up here with an entity divided within itself, whose other aspect consciousness experiences and finds it to be its own, but as the power it is violated and roused to hostility. When we violate the one law in the favor of the other law, sooner or later that first law is going to come looking for us. And it's going to exact its, as Hegel called it here, revenge, its racha, its retribution upon us. It is, after all, a law. So all of that is something we want to keep in mind as we're now moving into the next paragraph, where we're going to see even more discussion of the Oedipus cycle, but now framed in terms of children.